Hey everybody, welcome back to Video Game Episode Terasic and a continuing series on the MiSTer FPGA DE10 Nano project, and today we're doing an updated 32X video because Srg320 just recently released a new core that's got a lot of different features and a lot of improvements from the last time we looked at this when the 32X core had just come out. And it's super impressive when Srg320 does anything given his situation, and he is one of the best developers for MiSTer in my opinion. Before we get too far involved though, do me a huge favor, go down below, hit like and subscribe, and that notification bell definitely helps us out. And if you feel so inclined and want to support the channel, we got a Patreon link down below as well. But jumping right into the 32X test footage here, just be aware at the time that I'm doing this voiceover, it is a manual installation for the core. You got to copy that RBF file over to the consoles folder on your MiSTer SD card. That may change, and if it does, I'll leave an update in the description below. But right off the top, Afterburner here is just working identically as it would expect to be on real hardware. And I do have a 32X sitting right next to me with a copy of Afterburner. The speed is fluid, all the controls are working perfectly fine, all of the sprite scaling is here, because last time I checked Afterburner out, there were a few graphical glitches, and that's just because there's so much going on screen at once. And the 32X combines the video hardware of the Sega Genesis to produce an image. Some layers are going to be on the 32X hardware, other layers can be on the Sega Genesis, so if it's not all working perfectly in tandem, you will see some graphical glitches, but here, I see absolutely nothing whatsoever. This is an excellent version of Afterburner, and one of the primary reasons that I wanted a 32X back in the day, because I remember playing this in arcades, and home ports up to this time were not exactly great. And this is classic Sega, and it's working so well here. You'll see all of those sprites scaling in when we're getting our missile refill. It just looks incredible, and the sound is perfection as well. And some of this work is foundational to the Sega Saturn core because the 32X and the Sega Saturn have similar-ish processors on board, so it's not at all surprising that Srg320 works on them both in tandem, because I would assume that some of that work goes to inform the other core. Now moving on to one of the 32X's most well-known and in my opinion prettiest games is Knuckles Chaotix. That doesn't mean it's a good game, it just means it's the most well-known. And Sonic Team was maybe onto something here, but they kind of struggled with the entire concept, and I will say that while Knuckles Chaotix is not a terrible game, it is by no means anywhere near the original Sonic games on the Sega Genesis. But last time I covered this as well, it did have some freezing problems, and there were some audio glitches, but now this is playing exactly as you would expect it to, and you can tell how well it's drawing all the sprites and backgrounds and moving that around screen at the same time with the proper speed, because even though this might not be anywhere near as good as a traditional Sonic game, it does move at the same speed and spots, and that just looks incredible. It's a little bit disappointing that the developers couldn't come up with a better hook, pun intended, than two rings stuck together, but that is what Knuckles Chaotix is, and it definitely is a game you should check out because while it might not be perfect, there is a lot of interesting concepts here, and seeing it run on the 32X core looks spectacular. And that's why I love this core so much. I may own a 32X on my Sega CDX, a lot of X's in there, but maybe you don't, you want to check the games out, and that's why I love MiSTer so much, because 32X hardware is getting more expensive, and the games are not getting any cheaper either, so to experience Knuckles Chaotix on a real original hardware is going to cost you a couple $100, but with MiSTer FPGA we have that 32X implementation in Logic, and you can play the game. The core does have some nice options as well on the audio and video side. Obviously you're not going to want to go 16:9, but you do have some aspect ratio corrections here. You can do some scaling as well as border, but one of my favorite options that's in the core right now is going to be that composite blend. It gives you the option to put the composite filter over the video, so that way it kind of looks more like it was on one of those classic CRTs. You can play around and see if you like it or not, but I do like that in the core. And it does have backup saves as well featured in this experimental core. I don't know that I would 100% trust them with a long game, but it is here in its infancy. Now moving on to Super Tempo, the most colorful game in the 32X library in my opinion. It works incredibly, and last time the audio was a little bit scratchy, but now at least to my ear it sounds near to perfect. Go ahead and listen for like 45 seconds and leave me a comment and tell me what you think. Sounds basically perfect in my ear, but let me know what you think down below. And also let me know if you owned a 32X back when it was on store shelves, because I did not. I asked for one for Christmas, my parents didn't get me one, and maybe they were doing me a favor, because the 32X, while intriguing hardware, was a terrible business decision from Sega. They really fractured their hardware installation base way too far. But that's the great thing about something like MiSTer, is that we no longer need to worry about whether or not Sega is going to support the 32X with good games. The entire library has already lived its life and died its death, and now we can check the whole thing out in FPGA, and that's why cores like this are so incredible. Most of the people back in the day that were into games probably did not own a 32X or ever experience one, and it's still one of those things that some collectors may not add to their collection because they don't think the value is there, because some of the most popular games or most well-known games are also the most expensive, and MiSTer FPGA gives you the chance to play them. Now moving over to Metalhead, last time I played this it did seem like the frame rate was running slower than original hardware, and I'm happy to say now that I'm playing it here on the new core, it feels identical to real 32X hardware. This is what the 32X was designed for. This is what it was supposed to give us. We have polygons with full texture mapping. Now of course this isn't running at 60 frames a second, but back in the day you never expected that out of 3D hardware. If you got 20 frames a second you were happy, and if you got 30 you basically had the most powerful hardware known to man back then. But when you saw this in magazines back in the day, it felt like the future, because really the only place we were seeing true 3D was a couple Super Nintendo games, and mostly in arcades. And now with the new core, this just works exactly as I would expect it to. The controls are as responsive as they ever were, which is to say not very responsive, but mirroring real original hardware. And the visuals look great as well, and trust me, this might not look like much to you now, but when this came out in the 90s, this was insane. I had a friend who had a 32X and this game, and I marveled at just how impressive it looked back then, and it still looks really good now, and it kind of explains what the 32X's entire design ethos was. It was supposed to increase 2D capabilities for the Sega Genesis, but it was also supposed to bring 3D gaming home, and there's a couple more 3D examples I have in the video still. But if you want to play Metalhead on MiSTer, you can 100% do it today. I got to mission 3 with no issues whatsoever. And again, I just can't believe this still looks impressive to me. And I think it's just remembering being a kid and thinking to myself, that giant mech coming around the corner there, that was impressive as hell, and it still gives me that nostalgia feels of how impressive it is today. Now one game that everyone asked me to talk about last time I did a video, and I did forget to include it, is Blackthorn. This is basically Out of This World meets Prince of Persia in sort of a sci-fi fantasy setting that feels kind of like it's ripped out of Conan the Barbarian. And this game was excellent on 32X, and it is excellent on the MiSTer core. Maybe it's not doing as much with the 32X hardware as it possibly could, but it's still a really impressive game. And the best part is it's a really fun game as well. It's got a definite adventure game vibe with some platforming and action elements as well. And it's probably one that most people I feel like haven't played, so leave me a comment down below and tell me if you played Blackthorn or not. And I do like that that guy there is definitely in misery, so we may have to take care of that in just a moment. But you have this awesome inventory management system, you're always trying to figure out how to move forward, and it has some incredible violence as well because his skull is no longer there. But one of my favorite things about this game has always been the soundtrack. It's got a real hard rock, heavy metal vibe to it, so I'm going to give you a listen in just a second. But this is just fun to play on a 32X and MiSTer because again, this is not a cheap game, it's not the most expensive, but if you want to check it out and see if you want to buy it for your collection, you can do it here. Like I said, soundtrack awesome, listen, and I'll be right back. It sounds great, and it's such an interesting soundtrack that you probably don't get to hear much on the Genesis or 32X in that musical style. And again, last time I played this game on MiSTer, it did have some scratchy audio, and that seems to be almost 100% taken care of in this current core build, because I haven't really updated a 32X video in a few months now, so it seems like a really good time to revisit it. But this is another excellent experience you can have on the core, and Srg320 is just nailing it lately. He's got updates to 32X, updates to Sega Saturn, and that alpha work in progress Battletoads core. He seems to be a very, very busy man, and he's bringing us straight gold. Now moving on to another quote-unquote 3D experience, and yes, I know Doom is not technically 3D. This runs great. Now I know what people are going to say, what about the Doom Resurrection mod? I like to capture the original game, that way if there's any issues with it whatsoever, I know it's the core implementation and not a fan mod, and the Resurrection mods are absolutely incredible, and I may feature those on the next video I do on 32X, which will probably be when the core is fully publicly released. But that's why I don't do mods on these tests for the most part. I want to see how the original game is running on an FPGA implementation of the original hardware. And that's not to say that the 32X port of Doom is bad. It's definitely kind of riding the middle of the road as far as ports are concerned. But what it's doing here on the FPGA core is exactly what it would do on an original 32X. And that is because I own them both. And I have played through this just a little bit, but I got a really cheap copy back in the day. If I'm going to play Doom, it's not going to be on the 32X. But the Resurrection mod is worth playing on MiSTer FPGA. So if you've got a MiSTer and you want to play Doom, that is the way you want to play it. But as a purely technical test of what the core is doing with an original ROM file, this is exactly as you would expect Doom to be on the 32X. Everything's working, the sound is great for what it is, and the soundtrack for the 32X is a little bit crap, and it's slow enough frame rate that I end up dying really early like I usually do. Now, one of the marquee titles for the 32X back in the day was the home port of Virtua Fighter, because while we did get a port on Sega Genesis, it looked nothing like the Model 1 arcade original. When this was in magazines back in the day, or if you saw a preview in video maybe at a store shelf somewhere, when they used to have CRTs with VHSs looped with game previews, this blew your mind, because Virtua Fighter in arcades was absolutely spectacular. And when it came home to 32X, they did an excellent job of porting this game, and it works here in MiSTer spectacularly. Especially because the last time I tested it, sometimes I'd have freezing issues in the character selection screen, or sometimes I would have audio clicks and other clipping of the channel. Now on the current core build, it plays exactly like you would expect the 32X Virtua Fighter version to play. It's fast, it's fluid, the polygonal models look about as good as you're going to get out of the 32X. It is the original hardware experience recreated in FPGA by Srg320, and that is just spectacular. Now, this definitely isn't going to be the version you're going to want to play if you have unlimited options. Playing the Model 1 original or some of the ports are going to be a better time, but it is just amazing to have this. Now, on the other end of the fighting game spectrum, Cosmic Carnage also works, and I had somebody ask me if the game runs slow because of the core, or if this is just how Cosmic Carnage runs, and this is just how Cosmic Carnage runs. But what other game gives you a half biomech snake with a bikini top on? Not sure what the developers were thinking when they made this game, but it just didn't quite work out. It's slow, it's stilted, the frame rate is pretty abysmal. It does have some nice sprite scaling effects that the 32X could do that the Sega Genesis really couldn't, but outside of a technical showcase of it working and some sprite scaling, I will say this is definitely one you could skip for 32X, but people kept asking me about it, so apparently you are gluttons for punishment. But that is the current status of the 32X core for MiSTer as of the making of this video, and I feel like it's like 98% of the way there. I only caught one visual glitch the entire time, and that was in the intro to Knuckles Chaotix, but otherwise everything I tested for this video worked 100%. I couldn't find any issues. But leave me a comment down below and tell me if you want me to revisit 32X in like a month or two and see how it's doing, if there's an update, or if this is good enough for you. Short of that, 32X is near to here, and we are basically done, so we'll see you next time. Bye bye.